if you're a political junkie like I am, you're probably getting a little bit annoyed, frustrated, overwhelmed with the constant speculation about what is going to be in the budget. Well, today we might finally have had some relatively good news, which is that Rachel Reeves is contemplating, and maybe she's going to, scrap the two-child benefit cap. This was a cap that was first announced by David Cameron in 2015 and was implemented under Theresa May. And what it says is that you can only get benefits up to your second child. And the effect that this has is incredibly bad. It throws 500,000 children into poverty. And we've got a very high and climbing rate of child poverty in the UK. If nothing is done to try and alleviate this, such as scrapping the cap, then we're going to have 4.8 million children, or roughly 35% of all children, in poverty by 2030. And scrapping the cap is the most cost-effective way that we have of reducing child poverty. It costs 3.5 million a year, and it lifts 500,000 children out of poverty. So it is the right thing to do if you care about child poverty. And even if you don't care from a moral point of view, it makes economic sense. If children are growing up in poverty, they're not going to develop in the way that you might want them. They're not going to be doing well in school. They're not going to be becoming productive members of our society. So even if you just think about this as an investment in our future, then it's something we should clearly do. And there are lots of investments that are like that. But this is a move that's very unlikely to come with many positive impacts for the government in terms of them getting credit for doing it. Because like many things under Keir Starmer, it looks like the government are doing it reluctantly. Whatever the reality is, Keir Starmer around a year ago withdrew the whip from 7 members of parliament for backing an SNP motion on the topic of two-child benefits. John McDonnell amongst them, Zara Sultana amongst them, right? So it might have been the case that had they not suspended her, she wouldn't have trotted off with Jeremy Corbyn to set up a new political party that, if they can get their act together, might end up challenging them from the left. So not only were they against this a year ago, they were actually suspending MPs for backing motions to tell them to scrap it. So it looks like they are doing this incredibly reluctantly, even though I suspect the reality is that Keir Starmer does care about child poverty and that he does want to put something in place in the budget to reduce child poverty. But what haven't they done here? This is another situation where they've appeared to do it reluctantly, it's come out as a leak, and there isn't a political narrative behind it. There's just speculation. So nobody's come out and said, look, we really believe in this, we want to do it. This is part of our mission to reduce child poverty. It's just speculation at this stage. There isn't a narrative. And this is part of the government's overall problem. There's never a narrative with these things. So we're weeks away from the budget now. And there's also speculation, of course, that taxes are going to go up, specifically income tax. And Rachel Reeves today on Radio 5 was also talking about potentially having to cut spending alongside increasing taxes. So this is going to be an incredibly unpopular budget. And again, the government have not prepared the ground. And this goes all the way back to the general election, really. They thought they were being really clever, didn't they, when they said to us all, we're not going to put up taxes on working people. And they knew full well at that point that they were going to, in their first budget, get around that with that massive set of tax rises that we had in the first budget, £40 billion raised, with the biggest measure being an increase in employers' national insurance. This was a bit of a wheeze to get around the supposed pledge they made during the election, but it was as transparent as hell to everybody, and it was quite a damaging tax to put up. They'd backed themselves into a corner at the general election, and then they were forced to put a tax on jobs, essentially, by increasing employers' national insurance. So having fenced themselves in, something which I don't think politically they had to do, they could have been honest with us right at the general election. They could have made the case that actually, if we're going to have sustained spending on public services, if we're going to invest in the future, then we're going to need to increase taxes, and that's going to have to be broad-based. And they could have also argued, in addition to that, that corporation tax needs to go up, which is a tax on profits, and they could have argued that the wealthy need to pay more. So they could have made a properly political argument for what needed to happen. They could have got a mandate for that, and then they could have attempted to deliver it in office. But instead of doing that, they took the so-called cautious approach, and I warned at the time that if they did this, they were going to end up boxing themselves in, and they were going to have to find a political narrative in office that would be quite difficult because they wouldn't have a mandate for whatever it was that they wanted to do. And that's kind of where they find themselves now. Again, there's a sense that they are being forced to implement tax rises and spending cuts. These things are going to be unpopular anyway. But Tony Benn had this saying about politicians. He called them weather vane politicians. In other words, there are certain sorts of politicians that just seem to swing with the wind. And if you are one of those politicians, it can look like you're just being buffeted about by events. And that's kind of the sense that I think that everybody gets of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves going into this budget. There's a failure at this stage to set a clear political narrative, and really this endless speculation, we're still weeks away from the budget, is very damaging for them, because the longer they allow this to fester, the longer they allow the narrative to just not be there, the more people are going to worry about what tax rises are going to go up. And of course, it's just fundamentally bad for the economy to be in a situation where there is massive economic and political uncertainty about everything. And then there's a question about whether it is necessary to do this at all. One of the things that Rachel Reeves did in the general election campaign to try and make the Labour Party seem competent was to box herself in with a set of fiscal rules. And the fiscal rule that seems to be causing problems for the Labour Party at the moment is this desire to get debt as a percentage of GDP falling by the end of the Parliament. Now, if you think about it, there's no particular reason why the economic cycle and the political cycle, i.e. the length of a Parliament, should coincide. In other words, there's no particular reason why the end of a Parliament would be a good time to make sure that debt is falling as a percentage of GDP, and there's no particular economic reason why debt as a percentage of GDP should fall, apart from the kind of the barrier, I guess, they're about to meet, which is 100% debt to GDP ratio. But if you look at other economies, and indeed if you look at Britain in its past, we've had debt to GDP ratios that have been much higher. If you look at modern day Japan, their debt to GDP ratio is around about 250% of GDP. So there's no particular economic reason to do this, apart from to confront the argument that the press often throw at Labour governments, which is that they're not responsible with public finances. But that's not a good economic reason to do it. So I'm kind of suspicious about the fact that Labour need to do this at all. And what I certainly think is a problem is that governments, since the creation of the Office for Budget Responsibility, they're kind of beholden to this organisation that makes these projections about the future and essentially magics into existence black holes in the public finances, based not on the reality of the situation we find ourselves in, but based upon what is projected 3 years from now, or 4 years from now, or 5 years from now. And so what you end up having at every budget is tinkering around the edges to try and get within what the OBR think is a reasonable position to be in to meet a target 3 or 4 years down the line. And that leads to constant shifting of policies to try and hit targets that I don't think necessarily have to exist in order to meet projections of what might happen in the future. Well, this is no way to run an economy, in my view. The government should start with thinking about, well, what is the necessary spending that we need to happen? It needs to set its priorities in government, and then it needs to design a tax system that's going to allow the government to achieve its objectives. Now, doing things that way around might mean that taxes have to rise. But if they're going to rise, the government should think first about cracking down on tax avoidance, second about taxing corporations, third about taxing the rich, and there are ways of doing that that would be effective before it starts to look at more broad-based taxation. But it might be necessary in that context. If you've exhausted all of the other options, it might be necessary to make a political argument that Britain is an economy and a country where we believe that you can have high value, efficient, productive public services without paying commensurate taxes. And there's always been this problem in Britain that polling suggests that that is exactly what people want. People want to live in an economy, in a polity where there is Scandinavian public services and American levels of taxation. Well, even if you believe in modern monetary theory, those two things are just not consistent with each other. There needs to be a balance between taxation and spending. Otherwise, the sums just don't add up. Because even from a MMT perspective, if you spend too much without taking money out of the economy, it's going to be inflationary, right? So anyway, that's what I had to say about the budget. A little bit of a ramble this time, but I hope that's fine. I just needed to get this off my chest. If you enjoy content like this, do like and subscribe to the channel. And for now, goodbye and best wishes.